Hello, welcome back. This is part two of a video series I'm putting together that highlights the way I periodize my nutrition to kind of match the periodization process of training for an extreme endurance event or ultramarathons specifically. If you haven't, I would encourage you to watch part one, which kind of deals with the recovery and low intensity, low volume phase of my year where I'm kind of recovering from a race and kind of slowly getting back into training, just so you kind of have a little bit of context as to like what I'm building off of for this second part of my training. This part is kind of the part in my training where I start building up the volume back to what I would call kind of like peak base or peak volume, where I'm not doing a whole lot of intensity type stuff in running, but rather I'm solidifying that strong aerobic base and putting together that kind of foundation to build some more race specific workouts off of. Personally, I believe developing that strong aerobic base is key into making some of the more intensity workouts sustainable. So having that in place is a huge focus point in my training. And like I mentioned in the first video, I very much periodize my nutrition to kind of match the training phase that I'm in. So in this phase, as my running volume increases, I start getting kind of closer to that, upwards to 20 hours a week of running, doing some strength work, some mobility work, kind of stretching, rolling, foam rolling type stuff. My energy demands go up quite a bit from my more rest and recovery time frame, where I'm letting my mind and body kind of reset. So with that comes a lot more food to kind of fuel these endeavors. Since they're lower in intensity, I don't find a huge need to ramp up my carbohydrate during this. I do increase it a little bit compared to the rest and recovery phase, where I see very little need for carbohydrate. But I do definitely keep in mind that throughout the course of my periodized approach, I'm always trying to make fat kind of that primary macronutrient source. So that fat is always going to be the highest percentage of my intake. But it's the carbohydrates that I'm kind of manipulating a little bit as the training intensities and volume change. So peak base, a lot of times this will be somewhere where I'll build up to that 120, maybe even 150 mile weeks, although those 150 mile weeks are fairly rare. I usually tend to average around 100 miles, 120 miles a week during this phase when you add in some like deload weeks and stuff like that. So one of the biggest changes to my daily nutrition during this phase is that I'm eating more, and what I find is I start to gravitate away from kind of that 2 meal a day approach to like 3 meal or 2 big meals with a couple snacks or something like that. Partly it's just, I think, personal preference. I feel like if I try to jam the amount of energy I need during this phase into 2 meals, it just ends up being so much food that I don't feel as comfortable, so I try to spread it out a little bit more. And the way that kind of looks is I break it down into a kind of a percentage, so people can kind of get a look at what exactly my macronutrients are kind of doing during this phase. They kind of tend to, the carbohydrates move up a little bit from that 5% or less that I try to focus on in recovery to a little more liberal 10 to 15% carbohydrate, which is definitely very low compared to what you probably see most endurance athletes doing when they're taking on that big of a training load. My protein stays relatively similar from a percentage standpoint at that 10 to 20% range, and then my fats will kind of range between 65 and 80%. So it's still very much primarily fat, and that's still the main focus point, but I am trying to kind of reintroduce a little bit more carbohydrate, and that's somewhat twofold. One is just because with that much training, I feel like my body tends to feel a little more on point when I have that slight increase in carbohydrate. And also, you know, I want to try to maintain what I call like a metabolic flexibility. When I enter this phase of training, I'm coming out of a phase where I'm in pretty deep ketosis most of the time, if not all the time. So I'm trying to reintroduce some of those carbohydrate sources in order to keep my body reminded that, you know, glycogen stores are still, you know, something you want to be able to access, especially as I move into the next phase, and certainly when I'm racing. So that's kind of the twofold reason for bringing those carbohydrates back a little bit. In terms of what I'm eating, you know, a lot of the fat sources and meat sources stay pretty similar to the other phase. It's just kind of adding in a few more variety of things on the carbohydrate side. A couple of examples of what I'm doing when my protein and fat sources are kind of like grass-fed beef, chicken, like the whole chicken, not just one cut. Liver, I like to start bringing back some organ meats during this phase as I'm starting to stress my body and demand more micronutrients. I do a fair bit of salmon. When I'm doing steak, I try to focus on the higher fat ones like ribeyes or New York. I love eggs, so eggs definitely stay in the rotation. Uncured bacon is another one if I'm looking for a really high fat cut of meats with not too much protein in comparison to other meat sources. Some protein, fat, carbohydrate sources that kind of touch on all three of those macronutrients that I'll start introducing in this phase are like almonds and pumpkin seeds and that type of stuff. Some of the non-starchy vegetables I continue to focus on are like broccoli. I try to mix it up between broccoli flowerets and some sprouts from time to time. Spinach, arugula, beet leaves, purple cabbage, cauliflower, cucumber. I try to continue to keep those fermented foods in place too, to kind of keep that good strong digestive system in place. So things like sauerkraut, fermented carrots, fermented beets, kimchi, that type of stuff. Some of the pure fat sources I kind of continue to utilize are the coconut oil, coconut milk, clarified butter, extra virgin olive oil, avocado oil, MCT oil. Like I kind of mentioned in the last video, I tried to kind of compartmentalize the oils I use and the butters I use and the animal fats I use into like ones I'll use for cooking and ones I'll use for garnishing a dish afterwards. And the way I do that is I focus on the higher smoke point ones like the coconut oil or the avocado oil or the clarified butter or, you know, animal fats to kind of cook on those medium to slightly higher temperatures. And things like extra virgin olive oil that I want to avoid turning rancid by heating too much, I'll wait to put on after a dish. Some of the carbohydrate sources I start to reintroduce during this phase include raw honey, sweet potatoes, berries, melons, fermented organic like non-GMO corn from time to time, and it just kind of adds, like I try to add a little bit of that to my meals and snacks. Like I try to avoid in this phase doing any concentrated carbohydrate source all by itself. I like to try to get it in with a fairly good base of fat and protein to kind of minimize my body saying that's the primary fuel source. I'd rather it say, okay, that's a fuel source we have access to, but we're only going to use it when we need to in some of those higher intensity situations or higher energy demanding situations. I like to flavor my food with some spices. Some of the go-to ones I'll use is like a good Himalayan pink sea salt. One thing I've noticed on a high-fat approach is that your body does tend to go through sodium pretty quick, so I'm pretty liberal with salting a lot of my foods, and you know, finding a good high-quality salt source I think is really good, especially as the weather gets hotter. Other things I like to use is like oregano, parsley, turmeric as a great anti-inflammatory, you know, garlic, black pepper, cinnamon. So that's kind of like a general idea of like some of the grocery list items that I would focus on during this phase. It's not necessarily the list that you should follow or should go after. I encourage you to, you know, once you kind of find what your macronutrient ratios are during this phase of training, don't look at what you can't have, but rather look at the huge amount of options you do have. Pick your favorites that fall within your macronutrient needs, and then get creative with it and cook some tasty whole food meals.